I want to address a couple of the more of these audience questions, and some of them I'm going to need your help. I'm going to need your help, Barrett and Paul, on kind of deciphering the questions themselves. A question from Rajesh: how self algorithms are different from PAT? So I don't know what that means. Barrett, is any idea? Like, is self algorithm like a different means to the end? Any idea?
I mean, the only thing I can think of with regards to self-algorithms is that kind of machine learning or AI. I'd have to ask kind of a few follow-up questions for that to get a definitive answer.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to throw that
because
out
there are abilities. I mean, I'm seeing some abilities where there's learning, machine learning, and things are adapting to dynamically to different processes. But one needs the other. You need to have the ability to monitor and have feedback with PAT sensors to be able to do the other, I believe.
To feed the machine.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. A couple of questions around the questions that I anticipate will be difficult to answer, but we're going to give them a shot anyway because the audience wants to know around expense and time frames. So one of the questions from Tonga is flatly how expensive is PAT for a company to implement? And I know that's probably going to be wildly variable. But if we're starting where we stand, can either of you weigh in on some ballpark kind of like, well, here's what your investment might look like for a typical, let's say, monoclonal antibody at stage X? I don't know. Neither one of you are too eager to jump.
I don't want to be quoted because I could be vastly underestimating. And again, I'm kind of in the realm of other people's money, right? It's no longer my money that I'm spending. Yeah. I mean, your typical fermentation systems, quarter of $1,000,000. Your chrome skid's about the same. But then you have all the sensors and the feedback. I mean, it's a pretty big number.
Yeah. Yeah. Paul, anything to add there? I'm not asking you to share for the record. Paul, I know you're PR and IR people, so I would dare not ask you to share, specific figures. But anything to share on just sort of what the, what the ongoing commitment might look like.
I would share Barrett's reservation about numbers, and like I was laughing off camera because my response was a lot of money and a long time, recognizing that actually doesn't answer the question. But it's again, it's the fruit is worth the effort, but the fruit needs to be appropriate for the application, and that's why. I think for me, it's about that bigger picture justification, not just the business case or the expense associated with with this type of an investment. I feel like it's got to be a full picture type of view.
Yeah. And timeline, like you said, a long time. I mean, if you're starting where you stand and you want to get started with this to the point where you've got some real actionable data coming back from your analytical technologies, is it, let me put it this way, since I know I'm not going to get anybody nailed down on a specific time frame. Is it weeks, is it months, or is it years?
I think it's definitely years. And as I tried to say earlier, I think it's easier to develop a product with a process with continuous in mind, such that you can then build in not only the technology solutions, but equally, the data gathering and the consistency of process all the way through. So for me, it's multiple years, not one or two, but more 4 or 5 from a development, filing, sort of science and strategic perspective.
Mm-hmm. Okay. A couple more audience questions and we're going to need to wrap things up, but a few good ones just rolled in. Barrett, this one comes to you from Kinglin. For feedback control with PAT tools, is there a way or need to make sure the process is within the design space all the time?
Well, a short answer would be yes. I mean, when you're establishing your design space, that's kind of the outer limits of your process, right? And then as you advance down, you're kind of refining and tightening those up. So you obviously want to start with a very large design space at first, right? When you don't go into your phase one with a very tight, design space. You don't have your specs aren't as tight, things aren't as tight because you don't want to fail, because you don't have that process characterization, that institutional knowledge as you advance through the clinic and get more process knowledge. You don't want, ideally that design space is going to shrink, but it's going to shrink because you know your process well, and you've collected the data, you've done the analytics, and you know your normal operating ranges, right? Ideally, you de-risk everything. By the time you are at phase 3 in control strategy, all your risks for unit operations and what have you should all be green by that point. So I think if you're going out of that design space that you theoretically established over years of process knowledge, then yeah, I think that's a problem.
Excuse me, Paul, one last question from the audience for you, and that would be from Satish. And I'm thinking, the question is, can continuous manufacturing be beneficial for low volume, high margin products? And I think that should say, or high volume, low margin products, or both. Right. So we're looking for some sense, right, of again, that CBA, that cost benefit analysis.
Yep. Yeah, for me, Matt, I think it's a great question. And I think the stereotypical answer is, well, the higher the volume, the better the application. And certainly I'd agree with that. And, in a lot of cases, or at least in our past, high volume sort of went, along with lower margin. But I also would say that typically, at least my experience, the economics sort of kind of balances out the volume sense, right? So if it's lower volume and the market is, and it's a transformational therapy, the market will float a higher margin, and therefore, the loss of a batch is equally impactful, right? So I think, for me, it's about the application specifically, but I do think both would be my answer. Again, I think it's historically been a little more justified if I have a ton of volume, but for me, if it's lower volume and higher margin, it could also be higher cost as well, because of the value provided to the market by the impact. So I would say both.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Thanks, Paul. Well, I'm abusing your time at this point. We're over the hour, but I want to give you each an opportunity to wrap things up with. This is another impossible question from Matt Pillar. You can't summarize next step advice. Biopharma companies are all over the continuum in terms of their adoption of continuous and where they're headed with it. But just to wrap things up, Paul, since you're on my screen, I'm going to start with you. Give us, 2 or 3 kind of here and now steps or pieces of advice to getting confidently on the right path to continuous.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, Matt, and because we are wherever we are, my answer is create a strategy, right? I think in the science space, in a lot of cases, we like to think, strategy is more for the the corporate office or the CFO to manage. I think the creation of a strategy in this space with a particular end in mind, and then working backwards relative to the implementation of that strategy is important. So, where am I? Where do I want to be, whatever, 5 or 10 years from now? And then what do I need to do in order to get there? And as I've said a few times, I think, Barrett has indicated as well, what is the benefit of those strategic elements being implemented properly? What are we as a company, an organization, what are we going to see from that? So really just try to sort of build, a good strategic plan in this space, kind of the end in mind, where's the puck or the ball going to be, and then work backwards from there from an implementation perspective.
Thanks, Paul. Barrett, same question for you. Parting shots of wisdom.
I think, especially now that we're kind of in a world where everyone's collaborating, in industry and with health authorities, I think collaboration with your vendors and health authorities and your manufacturers. I think everyone is sharing knowledge. And I think if you partner early on, especially if you're looking to develop some of these specialized pieces of equipment and monitoring systems, partnering early on with your vendors that are making that equipment can only be helpful in advancing this and moving it forward.
Awesome. Guys, thank you so much for joining me. Thanks for hanging out for an extra couple minutes to address some audience questions. If I get one like big piece of criticism from the audience after these things, it's we don't feel like you're answering all of our questions, and we can't possibly. We can do some on the back end. We can't possibly. I think you guys did a good job though of addressing as many as possible. I thank you for joining me. You did a great job. I always enjoy talking with both of you.
Thanks,
Appreciate
Matt.
the opportunity. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks also to our audience for joining the discussion and asking such great questions. We appreciate that as well. And again, thank you to Sartorius for supporting today's panel. We appreciate them very much as well. As Miles mentioned, the presentation will be available on demand in 24 hours or so and should be available on our website as well a few days after that. So keep an eye on bioprocessonline.com for that. And in the meantime, have a great day.